Welcome to this case study class. My name's Kieran Doe. I'm a senior tutor at ACA Masters. When I sat the case study exam myself, I won the ICAEW prize for the highest score in the world with a mark of 92%. Several of my students have also won the ICAEW prize for the highest score in the world, whilst others have won regional prizes from ICAEW. This class is taken from my case study video course, which teaches the exam techniques and AI analysis skills to achieve this level of success. Full details for the course can be found on the case study page of the ACA Masters website. So if you head over to the case study page, you'll find full details for my video course and also our AI analysis document and mock exams and model answers. So during the class, I'll be using the AI analysis document and mock exams from a recent case study exam to demonstrate the exam technique to use, but full details for AI analysis, mock exams and model answers for current case studies can be found on the ACA Masters website. So the way the course is structured is that I'll firstly teach you the exam technique to use for each requirement in the case study exam. And I'll do this with a practical demonstration of each requirement using a mock exam from a recent case study. So once I've taught you the exam technique to use for each requirement in the case study exam, you can then go away and practice that exam technique using our mock exams from recent case studies and also the ICAEW exams. And to help you with this, you'll have access to our AI analysis and pro forma reports for the recent case study exams. So all of this work can be done prior to the release of your advanced information. So this is essential preparatory work, and this is something that you can do before the release of your advanced information. You understand the exam technique to use for each requirement and practice it using recent case studies and using both the mock exams available and the actual ICAEW exams. So once you have understood the exam technique to use for case study, and once you've practiced and mastered that exam technique, you'll be in an excellent position when your advanced information is released. So we'll then work through that live advanced information so I can demonstrate the type of analysis that needs to be undertaken and where each piece of information is likely to be useful in the exam. And having understood case study and the exam technique to use, this will actually be fairly obvious when we get to your live advanced information, and you'll be able to approach it in a much more exam focused way. So then after we've analysed the advanced information, there will be several mock exams on your live case study business for you to attempt. And then there will be debrief classes on those where I will explain exactly how you should have interpreted the requirement and how you should have used the exam information in order to produce exactly what the examiner is looking for. And I'll reference my model answer so you can see exactly what you need to produce in order to score a prize winning mark. So just to summarise, course structure is firstly to teach you the exam technique to use for case study, and then we will apply that to your live advanced information. So the way this class is structured, so this class where I'm teaching you the exam technique to use for case study. So I'm going to firstly explain how the advanced information is used and how it's useful in the exam and things to look out for. Then I'll explain what's included in the exam, what the requirements are and what you need to do. And then we'll look at each requirement in detail, where I will explain what the requirement normally is and what you need to do and how that then translates onto the marking key to ensure that you score a top mark. So for the practical demonstration, I'll be using the July 2024 ICAEW case study. So it's highly advisable that you read the advanced information prior to watching this class, and it would also be useful for you to watch my AI analysis class on this case study, as well as referring to my AI analysis document. So the advanced information, which is obviously released prior to the exam, provides background information on the company and is generally in the same format every time. So for every case study, as I've just explained, as we will do for your live case study business, we analyze this advanced information and we identify which exhibits are useful in the exam, or which pieces of information are useful in the exam, and how they are likely to be used. But it's really important to appreciate that this is in the same format every time. So we'll firstly have an introductory exhibit where it will kind of explain who we are, who the client is, and what they do. So that's quite useful in determining whether a disclaimer is required or not. Most commonly, our role is as an external advisor, so it is. Then we'll have an exhibit on the industry, which will provide background information on the industry. So we kind of get an understanding of how the business model works, the industry, the competitors, how they generate revenue and profits, typical costs, etc. We're told some useful information about the industry as a whole. We're quite often told some like benchmark figures, like expected industry growth, for example. So this is quite useful to provide us some context for all of the requirements really, and just to help kind of our overall understanding about the industry and the business. Then we get we usually get an exhibit on the specific company, which we have here. So we've got a specific one here on Jubal. So we can see here, we're told some information about the size of the company, who the directors are, etc. And again, that's useful for our kind of overall understanding of the business and the industry. So then we always get the management accounts for the last few years. And therefore we can kind of analyze this in terms of looking at revenue growth in the various revenue streams that the business has. We can calculate revenue mix, calculate the KPIs, etc. And this comes with some narrative as well, so we can start to identify the reasons why revenue goes up or down, or cost goes up or down, or any other amount goes up or down for the business, and things which have caused that to change in recent years. And we can also identify any further analysis that we can undertake. So we can kind of piece it all together by having the financial points and then also the narrative as well, kind of bring it all together like this. And this is really useful because in requirement 1, what we'll get is the most recent year, and then this will then be the prior year. So we'll essentially need to do this analysis again, but for the most recent year. And what we'll need to do is comment on the numbers, reasons why it's gone up or down, and then do some sort of further analysis. So this should be fairly familiar to you, having done BST, SBM, and also comes up in CR and possibly even a little bit in FAR as well. So there was some other analysis we could do on kind of top 10 writers, etc. But, we could do the same for cost of sales, look at the cost as a percentage of revenue. Obviously, when we're looking at profit, we can analyze the profit margin and see what causes that to change. Admin, of course, just like another layer of costs, some KPIs around this as well. And we talk about all of these metrics for this specific company in detail during the AI analysis class. So worth referring back to that. And then we can obviously analyze the balance sheet as well, particularly working capital here, with cash and receivables and payables, etc. And then intangibles was quite specific to this company because they were acquiring song catalogs. So that's where these exhibits are useful, primarily for requirement 1, but they provide useful context to requirements 2 and 3 as well. So then we're told some more general information about the business. So it's like competitors, it's staff, etc. It's portfolio of catalogs in this case. And as they were producing, as they were a music publisher, then obviously writers was important. So in a way, in another organization, this might be employees, but you can kind of see, employees, competitors, suppliers, would all kind of come up in these more general exhibits to give us an understanding of the business and possibly flag some potential issues. So then for requirements 2 and 3, we usually get a few specific exhibits which seem to indicate what a requirement 2 or a requirement 3 would be, and they usually give some sort of calculation or some sort of pro forma calculation. So we can see here this was about valuing catalogs, and there was 2 methods: the market multiple method and the income method. Not particularly technical, but you can kind of see how broadly these are related to kind of valuation methods you would have seen in FM and SBM, discounting cash flows or just using a multiple. So this calculation was heavily flagged and the issues around it, along with an example calculation. So this really indicated that this would be, a requirement 2 or a requirement 3, probably more a requirement 2 because it was more kind of computational, whereas we had this other exhibit on video game licensing, which was slightly less computational. The calculations were less technical, but of course they could be the other way around. But in most cases, the more computational technical calculation would be the requirement 2. But then we had this licensing of music to video games was the other calculation, but similar to that other exhibit, that indicated what a requirement 2 or a requirement 3 would be. And then we had this exhibit on AI, as in artificial intelligence. So that was a possible kind of ethics issue around this and how songs were going to be produced going forward. And then there was also this kind of related to that, a letter from the songwriters, essentially kind of opposing the use of AI. And then we always have this kind of strategy and risks exhibit as well, where it kind of says what the company's strategy is going forward. Quite often there might be some targets in here, so that's quite useful for requirement 1 when we're looking at the performance to see whether they've met the targets. And then there's usually like a risk register or a list of risks. And again, this is useful probably more so for requirements 2 or 3 because some of the issues in there might link back to this, and we can bring in a point about this risk register, and we'll talk about that when we look at those requirements. And then finally, we have media coverage, which will have a series of articles which will just tell us a few kind of specific issues, and they'll usually relate back to some of the things we've already seen. So like a video game startup company, so Meston. So obviously ties in back to video game licensing. This is a behemoth, which was selling songs, so therefore catalog valuation, so that linked into that potential requirement 2. VG was the video game licenser, so that linked back into that. This was one of the writers, and this was just about publicity of songs. So it does all fit together. It's usually in the same format. Well, it is in the same format every time. We get the same types of exhibits. So even though it's a different business, a different company, the same information is provided, and we can do the same type of analysis of each case study business, and this will equally apply to your exam. So it's really important to appreciate that this is in the same format every time. So actually, when you do analyze a past advance information for case study, you shouldn't think, this is, entirely useless. I'm looking at a past AI, it's not relevant. Whilst the specifics will be different, the format will be the same, the nature of the exhibits will be the same, and where they're used in the exam will be the same. So actually, building an understanding of the type of information that's included in the advanced information and where it's useful in the exam is incredibly useful to you. So really important to kind of appreciate how this all fits together. So having, analysed the advanced information, it's important that you have the key facts and figures, ready to use in the exam. But it's also important to appreciate that there are lots of points in the AI which will be irrelevant, in the exam. So don't try to force points from the AI into your answer in the exam, only bring in the points which are specifically relevant. That can be an issue for some students. They've over prepared on the AI essentially, and they're just desperate to bring in, perhaps a really good point that they've thought of in their preparation, but if it isn't relevant to the requirement, then there won't be any marks for it. So then we move on to the case study exam itself. So as I said, the AI is in the same format every time, and the exam is in the same format every time. So the requirements that we'll have in the exam, there will be 3 requirements. First one is analyze the financial performance of the company. So we'll have the most recent year. And as I said, that would be similar to the analysis that we've done on the previous year as part of our AI analysis. So we'll be doing that, and revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, and EBITDA. So actually you'd have a really good understanding of these, having done that AI analysis and having watched the class on that. So you'll kind of know what all the revenue streams are, what's caused them to go up or down, etc. And obviously the pro forma report, which I produce, kind of gives you kind of a loose template that you can use in the exam. And this type of requirement is similar to analyze the performance and position of the company, as you've seen before in SBM, CR, BST. So actually this is a requirement the students feel most comfortable on, and it's perhaps one of the reasons why students tend to spend too much time here at the detriment of requirements 2 and 3. So that's requirement 1. Probably the most predictable, and also the one students are most familiar with from earlier exams. So requirement 2 would be evaluating some sort of financial proposal. So we can see here with requirement 2, we can see an evaluation of the proposal to acquire a catalogue from Behemoth. So as I just demonstrated in the AI, there was an exhibit which specifically showed you how to calculate it under the income method, and also how to calculate it under the market multiple method. They've got the 2 methods there. So that was relatively predictable. And then we can consider some kind of non-financial issues, so commercial, ethical, and business trust issues. So actually this type of question has kind of come up in BST and SBM before, but this is probably a bit more kind of specific and more easily identifiable, from the AI. But the nature of this type of question has been examined in earlier exams. And then requirement 3, is quite similar to requirement 2. There'll be a calculation, and then we'll have some narrative, usually evaluating an opportunity or an issue, and then the obvious one, as we flagged from the AI, was obviously licensing music to Meston. So we can see here, do a calculation under two different bases, and then some narrative points along the lines of financial, operational, and strategic issues. So again, quite similar to kind of a BST style question there. So the exam is you get the same three requirements, you have to do the same sort of thing. The requirements 2 and 3 will be kind of flagged in the AI as I've just demonstrated. So the exam, relatively predictable because we know what the different requirements will be. So that's the advanced information, the exam paper, broadly in the same format, and as is the marking key as well. So the marking key for each requirement, the boxes for each requirement, and also the points in each box are in the same format every time. So therefore, because we've got the advanced information, the exam paper, and the marking key in the same format every time, then we can develop an approach and an exam technique to use, which you can apply to each case study exam in a similar way as we've done for earlier exams. All of them, accounting, tax, financial management, business strategy. And you can develop an exam technique which you can apply broadly to each different exam question for that particular type of question. Obviously, we'll tweak it slightly based on the specific facts for that particular business or that particular question. So what we'll do now is we'll go through each requirement one by one, and I'll explain the specifics of what you need to do for each requirement and each part of the requirement. So requirement 1, we can really divide this into two parts. There's the first part, which is analysing the performance and possibly also the position of the company. As I said, this is the most common or the most predictable, and also the requirement that you're most familiar with from earlier exams, having seen this question in BST, SBM, and CR. So as I said, what we need to do here is compare the performance to the prior year. So has revenue gone up or down? Give a reason for that movement, ideally getting that reason from the exam paper. Then usually undertake some sort of further analysis of the numbers if you can, or identify a trend or significant movement. That's perhaps the hardest part. And then give some context of the performance. So, as I said, in the advanced information, you have the prior year accounts, we have the reasons for the prior year movement. So that gives us some context and some understanding of why things move in a certain way. We're quite often given some performance targets as well. So we've got something we can benchmark the performance to, and then we're also provided with some context. So actually, as I said, as part of the AI analysis, we'll go through the management accounts in detail, think about how we'll structure our analysis of the management accounts, identify reasons why certain items have gone up or down in earlier years, because we may have the same reasons in the current year. And we thought about what causes margins to move. We've got the KPIs, we know the performance targets for the KPIs as well. So we've picked up all of that information as part of our AI analysis. And we're also able to build out kind of a pro forma report, thinking about, well, if the requirement asks for revenue, which every case study exam has, it would be quite difficult to analyse the performance of a business without looking at revenue. So we've actually already thought about how we would structure our revenue section, and even thought about where we would integrate kind of the KPIs into our analysis, etc. So we've done all of this work in advance. So we're quite well prepared for requirement 1. So then in the exam, the information which will be given is, of course, the requirement telling us exactly where to focus. And it's very important that we answer exactly what the examiner's asked for. So, revenue, cost of sales, gross profit and EBITDA. So therefore there'll be no marks for kind of analysing, operating profit or tax or, profit after tax. So the requirement will tell us where to focus, and it's telling us, user management accounts, user additional information and the KPIs. So the information which we're provided, of course, is the current year accounts, and these will be provided in the pre-populated spreadsheet. So we can see here that we've got the latest accounts. Remember, in the AI we had 2023 was the latest year. Now we have 24. So we've got the P&L, including the changes already calculated, P&L, SFP, and then also the notes. So we have the same information that's provided in the advanced information just for the most recent year and with the changes already calculated. So we'll have the accounts and the notes in the pre-populated spreadsheet, and then we'll also have some narrative to go with that from the finance director, which will give us some reasons why certain things have gone up or down. And we want to use this information as much as possible in our answer. So this will give us reasons why things have gone up or down. And we may also be given some new numbers as well. So we're given the KPI targets for the current year, kind of updated numbers here as well. So some numbers might be provided in the pre-populated spreadsheet, like the management accounts and the notes, but then we may get some additional information, including numbers, in the exam paper itself. And we're going to use all the information that we're provided, or we're going to look to use all the information that's provided. And then again, we've got the top 10 writers here, which again, further information we're given here that we can do analysis of. So we're given narrative information, and then we're also given numerical and financial information. So current year accounts, reasons for the current year movement, and possibly also some additional context of that performance. So like I said, we're fairly well prepared for this requirement, having got into the exam with the pro forma report and practiced lots of mock exams on this. So therefore you kind of know what to expect and also the exam technique to use. But always really important that you focus on the specific requirement wording and you don't answer a question that you thought was going to come up or that you hoped would come up or that came up in the mock exam. You want to focus on exactly what the examiner has asked you for. So, remember the technique that you've been practicing, but, don't try to push points in from the AI or points that were in, the mock exams that aren't relevant on the actual exam. So we've got the different headings here. So therefore we know how we're going to structure our answer, and we'll talk in more detail later on about how to kind of gauge how much to write for each section. But we know we're going to have a heading for revenue, a heading for cost of sales and gross profit, and a heading for EBITDA. We'll come back to the request for advice. So you can kind of see this it was predicted from the pro forma report, but we didn't know exactly. We thought we might possibly get operating profit. Operating profit hasn't been asked for. We've been asked to stop at EBITDA, and therefore there'll be no marks for kind of analysing depreciation or operating profit. So that's a kind of a good example of making sure you answer exactly what the examiner has asked for and not what you kind of hoped would come up or thought would come up. So straight away we know what our headings are. And then of course we've got the exam paper information, which is giving us the reasons why things have gone up or down. And then we've obviously got the numbers we've got the accounts and the notes in the pre-populated spreadsheet. And then we've also got further numbers on the exam paper itself. So there are different ways you could approach this. You know, me personally, what I quite like to do is just to have a kind of a quick look at the numbers to see how they've moved. Because, in the build up to the exam, there's a lot of speculation and anticipation of, will it be a good year? Will it be a poor year? Will profit margins go up or down? Particularly if your own case study business, you'll be thinking about that a lot, and you'll be practicing different mock exams. Some they would have had a good year, others, the business would have had a bad year. So I just quite like to actually see, first of all, just briefly, has it been a good year or a bad year? And you can see, revenue's gone up. That's obviously positive, but you can think about it in the context of previous growth and perhaps any targets that there might be. The cost of sales have gone up broadly in line, not quite as much. So that'll be an improvement to the gross profit margin. There'll be a slight increase in the profit margin. Admin expenses, as we can see, are up, but not as much as revenue. And EBITDA is up, but of course we can see here that the EBITDA increase is not as high as the increase in revenue, so therefore EBITDA margin would be falling. So kind of have a quick look there. Maybe have a look here, the intangibles. It's quite difficult to analyze whether that they've acquired new catalogs or that's amortization, but we'll see that in the note. Look at the cash balance, because cash was an important consideration with this business, as we discussed in the AI analysis class. You can see they've made a repayment of the loan, but they've still got a cash balance. That's probably more useful for requirements 2 and 3, but can be useful in requirement 1 as well. It depends what we're asked to do and what we're looking at. So more detail here on cash flows with the cash flow statement. You can see here, possibly there's been an impairment of one of the intangibles. That was something quite specific to this business. But we can see here they've obviously acquired a catalogue, a large kind of acquisition there, but they've obviously sold one as well. So maybe we'll be told some information about that. Already seen, they've obviously repaid some of that loan as we had picked up looking at the loan balance. And then we've got, the accounts. So looking at the different streams that we had, we can see digital and sync have had a particularly good year. Performance, not so much. And we can see in terms of the territories, Asia has done particularly well. So, we would probably expect to get some sort of reason in the exam paper narrative as to why that is, but we'll have to wait and see. Purchase and sale of rights, but we saw from the intangibles that they'd obviously acquired and sold some catalogs, so we can pick. That's kind of consistent with what we've seen there. Others had quite a big change there. It's almost like an unusual number, so perhaps we'll be given a reason for that. And like we said with the intangible, so I'd probably primarily really be looking, just kind of briefly having a look at the headline numbers. Has it been a good year or a bad year? Might just want to have a quick look at the different revenue streams to see which ones in particular have gone up or down. And then I'll look at the information that we're given here. So we can see that we're given the targets for the KPIs, but not the actual results. We'll need to calculate those. So we're given updated targets essentially for the KPIs, so we can see what they are. But, having worked with the advanced information, we knew what all the KPIs were, what they represent, how they've moved in, most recent years, and how to calculate them. So actually kind of calculating them would be straightforward. And then as we expected, as we got in the AI, number of songs and detail on the advances. So we've got all of that information there. And we'll use some of this in our analysis. We've seen that they've acquired new catalogs and they sold some catalogs as well. So that's kind of consistent with what we saw in the financial statements. And then we're told about kind of an impairment of an advance here as well. So, we'll certainly be bringing these into our analysis, and we'll be using this for kind of like revenue per song. And we might be making some points around some of the cost lines about catalogs acquired, etc. So then we're told the total number of streams for the song. So we can see that's above the target, albeit slightly. So we'll definitely be mentioning that point. So that's relevant for digital. And we can also use that to calculate effective revenue per stream. So we're told about an agreement with a digital service provider in Asia and negotiated a preferential royalty rate. So maybe the effective revenue per stream has changed, but also this gives us a reason why Asia has gone up by so much. If we do analysis by territory, that gives us a reason why Asia's gone up, and also digital as well, because of the number of streams. And we've thought about all of that. We've already got our kind of paragraph kind of broadly set out. So, we could start perhaps even populating this if you wanted to. So for digital revenue, we've got the reason there from the exam paper why that one's gone up, because of the change in streams, and then also specifically Asia. So you could even, just have a kind of a little comment here saying like Asia, just scribble that onto your pro forma report perhaps. So then we've got A&R team secure this number of sync placements. So this means that we'll be able to do the analysis of sync placements to calculate average revenue per placement, an interesting metric that we kind of discussed in the AI class. So that's average revenue per song, average revenue per sync placement. So we can basically break the analysis of sync down between volume and growth. Is it due to effectively an increase in price, average revenue per placement, or is it due to an increase in the number of placements? Again, we talked about this in detail in the AI analysis class. So we're told following positive feedback from Rhythm Ride's users about our songs, licensing agreement was expanded to include 11 new songs, 5 written by Chester Wright. So here we're told, for sync, the agreement has been expanded. So that would be a reason why that's gone up so significantly. And then we're told specifically about this specific writer. So when we do an analysis of the writers of this information, that's a reason there why Chester Rice's revenue may be higher than it was in the previous year. And as we can kind of see here, it certainly is. And then we're kind of told, more. So as we're reading through this information, we kind of reading it actively, thinking, I'm going to use this, when I'm explaining the change in digital, I'll use this for the change in Asia. I'll use this part of my sync analysis. I'll incorporate this in my sync analysis and bring in the specific writer in here as well. So to assist A&R teams with the identification of new talent and the assessment of market trends, they engage an AI-based data analytics consultant, Musico, helped identify songs gaining popularity on social media and predict the songwriter's future success. So they've signed several young songwriters, and we're told about these fees as well. So you can think about how this might be helping attract new songwriter talent, but we're told that actually using AI-based provider or using AI, we were told the fees are 160k, and we actually had in the advanced information some information regarding expected expenditure around that, so we could obviously compare that with that. And then we're told some specifics about writers and catalogues. We're told that they've purchased a new catalogue, as we've already seen from the earlier part. And we're told there's complex legal issues. So we saw this in the accounts, complex legal issues around his most popular song, but these were resolved. But these legal issues have probably contributed to these higher costs that we've seen on purchase and sale of rights. Then A&R obviously going up because of the AI-based consultant. So we're told that they sold a catalogue, so that would have also contributed to the cost around purchase and sale of rights. We're told one catalogue has been impaired. So that's obviously the reason why amortization and impairment, when it's actually decreased, we're told that was the only catalogue impairment. So in the previous year, more catalogues had been impaired. So actually there'd been a lower impairment. And then we've got the analysis of the top 10 writers, which we'll need this to do one of the KPIs around the top 10 as a percentage of revenue, but we could also do some additional analysis on these numbers as well, looking at specific writers. So you can see just by having a quick look through the information that we're given, we can start to think about how we're going to use this information in our analysis. We've obviously got the numbers that we're provided in the management accounts, and then we've got the reasons here. So in the pre-populated spreadsheet, which has the management accounts, it obviously doesn't have everything that we need. As we discussed in the AI analysis class, we're going to need to look at revenue mix, for example. That isn't in there, so we're going to need to calculate revenue mix to bring into our answer, and then we've got all of the KPIs as well that we need to calculate, as well as our analysis of the top 10 writers. So you provided this in the pre-populated spreadsheet area, but then we'll use it to do our analysis. So for example, if we want to have revenue mix, one way you could do this, you could copy it over to a new tab, but just remember that everything you produce that you want the examiner to see then needs to be brought into the word processing area. So you could start with this and copy it into a new tab to have your appendix, or what you could do is just insert some rows here to then calculate the mix. So you could insert some rows and then calculate the revenue mix underneath it, and then do the same for territory. So you can see, as I've done here, this is how the spreadsheet started, and you can just insert some rows to calculate revenue mix, and then you could just kind of copy this over into your word processing area. It's fine to have some numbers that the examiners have already provided, and I would probably kind of do it this way. So we wouldn't need to copy all of this into our appendix. Even if we do use those numbers, we're only going to get marks in the appendix for calculating any new numbers, obviously not numbers that we've already been given. So in doing revenue mix, we've got the revenue figure in the note, and then calculating the mix based on that. And you can recalculate those here in the same way, but of course we've got the prior year mix from our AI analysis. You could do that and then just check them, because that would tell you that your formulas are set up correctly. And then of course we can do mix by territory as well in exactly the same way, so you can insert that. And then top 10 writers, we've got the top 10 writers figure, which came from the exam paper as part of the information that we're provided in the exam paper. And then we could look at that as a percentage of revenue, and we're told the target is still 35%, so that's now exceeded that. Obviously give a number of songs on the exam paper, so we can calculate average revenue per song. And this was all tested in the mock exams. This is one of the mock exams, but in the real exam you could do the same thing. So if you're not as familiar with this advanced information, some of this might not seem that obvious, but actually when you go back to the advanced information that was provided and my AI analysis class, we went through this in great detail. And of course the AI analysis document really kind of helped you with this. So you can see number of songs and therefore average revenue per song, which is below the target. You could even look at average revenue in the top 10 songs. Song growth, which we've seen, that was another KPI. And then the analysis of sync, as I said, breaking it down between effectively price and volume, number of placements and price per placement. And then digital, so further analysis of digital here, number of streams and average revenue per stream that we could calculate. So all very much as per the AI. And then you could do the analysis of the top 10 writers. So maybe look at adding average revenue per song, for example, look at the particular revenue share of writers, and look at how the revenue has changed for some of the specific writers, being careful to note that the top 10 has changed, so they're not all the same. So therefore, this is the new one that we were told about, so we haven't got a comparative there to calculate the revenue change. So, particularly for things like mix, you're going to need to start with the information that's already provided. So we obviously using that to calculate the percentages. And then we've got the KPIs, which we have been able to calculate as well. So we'd already thought about, how we're going to use this information. So we've got the different revenue streams here. And we'd already thought in detail about how we would do this, but essentially what we're trying to do is we're going to say how the number has changed. So that's really the easy bit. Then we're going to give a reason, which isn't too difficult. We'll try to use the exam paper as much as we can. So as I kind of said here with digital, the fact that they've got the new DSP in Asia. And of course, you can do the analysis of is it due to volume or price. Then perhaps a harder bit, maybe kind of a comment on the trend or the significance of it. Any further analysis, that's probably harder. And then if there's a relevant context point, either from the AI or elsewhere on the exam paper, then we can bring that in. So you don't do this at every point, because if we just think about this on the marking key, there's about 4 points there in total for context points. So just do the most obvious ones on the most relevant changes, most significant changes. So we can see here, easy bit's a number with a reason from the exam paper, further analysis, and then a context point. And that's for digital, and then we'll do the same for performance, sync, and mechanical. And we've already thought about, as I've been saying, as we go through, clearly we're going to use this for digital, we're going to use this for sync, in terms of the additional analysis we've done of the numbers, but then also in terms of the narrative that we're given on the exam paper. So when we then bring this into our answer, we've already got our pro forma report to guide us, but you can see, what I've done here is digital revenue has increased. I've given some opinion there. I've said that's an incredible increase, 37.2%. So that's the easy bit that I'm talking about, the number. The reason that we've picked up from the exam paper, the new agreement with the DSP in Asia, and then kind of as a further reason, or more the further analysis point, is what has caused that growth. And we can see that actually it's due to an increase in the number of streams, which is above the target, and an increase in average revenue per stream. So this is a quite simple volume price analysis. Is it the number of streams, i.e. volume, or the revenue per stream, the price per unit? And we discussed this in great detail in the AI class, so students were very comfortable at how to do this analysis. And then we've got the context point. So you can see, how to structure these points, these mini paragraphs. And then a similar thing with sync. Again, numbers gone up with some sort of comment, significant. That's the easy bit. Nice and easy there. Now the reason is due to, and this is kind of the reason and the further analysis, number of sync placements. Again, that's kind of that volume versus price analysis, where we've said it's an increase in placements, so volume, and not an increase in price per placement, so price per unit, because that's actually gone down. And then we were obviously told in the exam paper specifically about these rhythm ride songs. So some further analysis here, specifically on Chester Rice, and then that's when I brought in my further analysis of the writer. So Chester Rice, where we did this further analysis here of the top 10 writers, and we told specifically Chester Rice. Now, you could have mentioned he's got more songs or higher average revenue per song. You could have looked at that. And I just chose to mention like his overall increase in revenue. And then we've kind of got a context point here as well. Now, it's not always possible to do kind of all four things. As I said, there's only a few context points, about 4 context points on the whole requirement as a whole. So, you can't do that, and it's not worth doing that at the end of every point, and there won't be a relevant point to mention for each. And sometimes you can't do like further analysis as well. So sometimes you just have the number and the reason. Sometimes you really won't have much at all. So like performance, we weren't told anything really in the exam paper about performance revenue. There's nothing mentioned here about performance revenue. It's, gone up, very insignificantly. We're still going to comment on it. It's becoming a less significant part of revenue. There's nothing really we knew from the AI that was probably, causing it to change, that much in the current year. Could possibly have mentioned, they've got some new writers in new countries, but, that's just an AI point. So there really wasn't much to mention here, and that's okay. We've done so much analysis of these two. If there really isn't anything to say, then you could briefly mention a point from the AI, or you could just say, it's gone up, this is a number, and then comment on the trend. It's continued to grow. So really all we're doing here is the easy bit with the number, and then kind of like a further insight point, which can be as simple as just saying kind of continues to grow. And then mechanical, we've done the same. So the easy bit with the number, and just saying it showed resilience despite the shift towards digital, because this is kind of like CDs and cassettes and that sort of thing. So it isn't always possible to kind of do a very detailed analysis of every revenue stream. Some you will just mention briefly. So what we're trying to do here, you see the marking key, these two boxes here are of course for revenue. So you can see here, what I've done with digital, the first point I mentioned was the number. So by mentioning that in the report, so I've got this mark here. And if there's a backslash, you can mention either of these points to get the mark. You don't need both. If you needed both, it would say and. So we've got the mark here. So then I've gone on and given the reasons. I've mentioned the new DSP in Asia. So could possibly might get that one. And I've done a further analysis of saying the streams are above the target. And I also mentioned the change in price as well. So you can see when there's a backslash, you only get one mark. So sometimes in a way it's nice because there's more possibilities of getting this mark. But if you mention both, sometimes it can feel a bit unfortunate because you've got 2 points and you only got 1 mark. But that's just the way it goes with case study. So we've kind of got the number, possibly we get this the reason, but it is saying, that's linking that to Asia. But we did actually mention that, I think, in the answer. I've said new agreement with the DSP in Asia. So we've kind of got number, reason, further analysis. And then the context point about the CMA report, shift towards streaming. So it doesn't have to be literally, word for word. But you can see here that I've mentioned streaming accounts for a larger share, but royalties are lower. But yeah, streaming is accounting for a larger share. That means the same as a shift towards streaming. So you'd still get the mark. It doesn't need to be literally word for word as long as you have made that point. So you can see what I'm doing, number, reason, further insight, analysis point, and then a context point. And then, similar thing for sync, number is what I did first, commented on. So you had to get this mark, you had to say placements were up, which I did. And you had to say average revenue per placement was down, and in bold with a figure. So therefore you can see, I've done that, sync up, number of placements up, but revenue per placement down with the number. So very important to be specific with the numbers. And I've mentioned a point about Chester Rice, and you can see here, if there's a comment on an individual writer, e.g. Chester Rice, picked up that mark there. And then the context point for sync wasn't on there about the copyright breaches, I don't think. And then performance and mechanical, I was a bit briefer there, but, just picked up a mark. There weren't any other marks for those because there wasn't much to say, as we've said. So you can see that I kind of jumped straight to the individual revenue streams rather than doing overall revenue, just because I wanted to teach that initial technique of number, reason, further insight, context point, because that's what we do most of all for this requirement one. Overall revenue is just a bit different because obviously we're not going to say, overall revenue increased because, digital, went up by this and sync went up by this, because we're about to look at all of those individual streams one by one. So we're not just going to explain revenue went up because digital went up. Whilst we might have a point saying growth was mainly due to digital, or revenue from all sources and territories has increased, we're not going to repeat all of the numbers up here because we're going to mention them, take them out, strip them out one by one. So overall revenue is up. So we'll mention the number. That's a key headline number. We've mentioned it's up, but then we're going to do some analysis of it, doing things like comparing it to the industry growth, comparing it to prior year growth. And then if we've got some KPIs which don't relate specifically to a particular stream, then we'll mention them with overall revenue. You can see like the KPI around streaming, we've brought that in with digital because that's where that relates to, or the KPI with sync placements obviously relates to syncs, we've brought that in there. But there's some more ones which relate to all of the different sources, things like average revenue per song and revenue share of the top 10 writers, which sit quite nicely here. So we say overall revenue, again, given a comment, that's impressive, key headline number here. And I like to include the actual current year number as well, because this is like a main number, overall revenue, whereas here I've just done the change in the percentage. So compared it to the industry growth, and then mentioning it in like the economic context, weak economy and lower disposable income at the time of this case study. So that may have had a negative impact, and then comparing it to the prior year growth. There's almost always a mark for that. And then we can look at the KPIs and say whether they're above or below the target. So the revenue share of the top 10, average revenue per song, below the target. Portfolio growth is above the target and reverses the downward trend. So you can see here, mark for mentioning overall revenue in the report. And then some of the KPIs are kind of dotted around on the other points, so revenue per song, portfolio growth, growth above the forecast, but lower than the previous year. Again, a shame that they're backslashed, but that's just the way it goes. And then finally, we would have a point on revenue mix. So you could do it by source, you could do it by territory, you could do it by both. If you've got time, obviously it would be nice to do it by both, particularly because we had a reason here as to why Asia had gone up. So we kind of did which one is in the highest absolute growth and which one is in the highest relative growth, and the reason for that. And then the analysis being which one is increasing in importance or which one is decreasing in importance. And we can see here marks here for revenue mix. So you can kind of see, with that approach, we've picked up all of the marks there for revenue. Obviously mentioned this point as well. And we've, analyzed the KPIs. We've compared them to the targets, and we've analysed the writers. So we've calculated the KPIs and calculated the writers as some additional analysis. That's not provided in the management accounts. We've had to undertake that additional analysis to calculate the KPIs and to analyse the top writers and comparing those results to the targets. So you can see this exam technique is similar to what we've used in previous exams, number, reason, further insight points. And you can just see how that will ensure that you pick up marks in the different boxes. This is generally fairly easy. These is the harder points to get these kind of further analysis points, but not too difficult all the same. And then the context points are generally relatively easy to pick up and integrate into your answer. So therefore you can see the exam technique to use there in terms of structuring your report, how to use the information, both the management accounts that we are provided with and also any additional numerical information on the exam paper, and how to kind of integrate that together and undertake further analysis, and then how to use the narrative as part of the reasons and possibly further analysis to undertake as part of our answer. So you can kind of see there how I've really used all of the information that the examiner has provided us with in order to produce an answer which picks up marks across all the boxes whilst doing that in a time efficient manner. So having undertaken the revenue analysis, we can then move over to the next sections we were asked for, which were cost of sales and gross profit. The two go well together because obviously you can't analyse gross profit really without having looked at cost of sales. We've analysed revenue minus cost of sales to get down to gross profit. And again, we talked about this a lot in the AI analysis class, and we're able to put together a pro forma of how you would analyse cost of sales and gross profit. So again, headline numbers are in the management accounts. We saw cost of sales move by 24.5%, slower increase than revenue. Has a positive impact on the margin. And then we've got the breakdown of the costs by category. So we can see those there. And again, you could high level have a look at the numbers. Well, royalties have increased by more than revenue. So therefore, when we look at that as a percentage of revenue, we can see royalties will be increasing as a percentage of revenue. A&R had gone up quite significantly as well. And we had a reason from the exam paper for that. Remember when we analysed the exam paper information, we were told that they had incurred AI, as in artificial intelligence fees, of 160k. So we've picked that up there and thought about how we would be using that. And then, of course, there were a lot around the purchase and sale of rights, which has gone up significantly. And we were told there were some complex issues around that. And then on the amortization as well, we were told there'd only been one impairment in the year. So that's a reason why that would be lower. So therefore, you can kind of see again, we can look at the headline numbers. We've understood from the narrative the reasons why these have changed. And then we could think, is there any further analysis that we could do? So again, with the cost of sales, this is just as what's provided by the examiner in a pre-populated spreadsheet. We could insert some rows and then look at doing it as a percent, each cost as a percentage of revenue. And then as we discussed in the AI class, you could strip out the impact of the impairment on the royalties to see, is the underlying cost increasing as a percentage of revenue, and it is, and that's something that we flagged and talked in detail in the AI analysis class. So then our approach and our structure with costs is exactly the same really as it is for revenue. So again, we'll come back to overall, but let's look at these. Royalties increase substantially. Here's the number, so the easy bit, the number. Then we've got kind of like further analysis, and we haven't really got a particular reason why they've gone up. So we've done some further analysis looking at it as a percentage of revenue, and then also excluding the impairment. So we can kind of see that. So we've kind of done the easy number and then some further analysis, which was a bit tricky. A&R, probably one of our more classic approaches in that we've got the number, so the nice easy bit, the reason from the exam paper, which isn't that difficult and will attract a mark. So using the new AI-based software, probably more of a medium mark. median point to get. And then like the further analysis as a percentage of revenue. And then also we managed to get a context point here because we were able to say what the AI spend was expected to be. So we can see it was higher than that. And then we've just done the same here, purchase and sale costs increased dramatically. So the number, the easy bit, the reason that we got from the exam paper, the complex legal issues from the sale of the catalogue, further analysis about the percentage of revenue. And then, some context, actually 2023 was a low base because there was only one completed transaction. And then similarly with amortization, number, reason, further analysis. So you can see we're doing the same thing and attempting the same thing here. So you can see royalties, nice and easy with the number. And then the further analysis point is continue to increase as a percentage of revenue. A&R, easy with the number, relatively easy really with the point from the exam paper. And then that was just backslash. You could have mentioned either there. And then amortization and impairment kind of shared on this point here. So you only needed to mention either and could have mentioned either of those points there. But of course, I mentioned both. So again, it's similar to revenue in terms of the technique. It's the same technique, number, reason, further insight, and a context point if it's relevant. So then with overall cost of sales, like overall revenue, we're going to say overall costs increase, but we're not going to say, because there was an increase of royalties of this and an increase in A&R of this, because we're going to analyse them below. So we'll say what the headline change is, and then like we did with overall revenue, could say whether revenue, whether all amounts have increased or decreased, and with costs, all costs except amortization increased. So we've kind of got that point there. And slower than revenue, which has an impact on margins. This has a positive impact on margins, obviously, as I mentioned earlier. So again, this was all kind of quite nicely set out in the pro forma reports. You're going to have this to guide you in the exam. So that's the costs analysed. And then with gross profit, we can say gross profit has gone up. Again, this is a key headline number. So I'd quite like to mention the number. You need to have a K there, a bit of a small typo mistake in my answer. But we can see here that we've got GP increased up to this amount and the margin. This is important to focus on the profit margin. So it's increased slightly. And why has that increased? Well, actually, it's quite useful to look at these costs as a percentage of revenue, because actually these are all increasing as a percentage of revenue, which has a negative impact on the margin. But actually it's predominantly due to the fact that amortization and impairment has fallen so significantly. Amortization, impairment, and also personnel costs decrease as a percentage of revenue. And then comment on the trend. It's continued its upward trend there. So again, you can see here how we would pick up the marks here for gross profit, and this is when we mentioned the cost of sales point as well, and then some easy marks there as well. And then we do exactly the same thing for admin. This is just the next layer of costs. So we have these admin costs here, where are the significant changes? Marketing's increased significantly. That's also the biggest cost. So we'll probably comment on that. Others gone down significantly, and it's actually negative now. So we might comment on that as well. But these have all gone up, and we're not looking at depreciation because remember we're looking at EBITDA. So that's kind of excluding that. But we were asked to comment on gross profit, which is why we considered amortization. And again, could calculate as a percentage of revenue. And there was also this other KPI, which was average running costs per song. And we talked in detail about how to calculate this in the AI class, but cost of sales, admin, and then stripping out the non-cash items, total costs, number of songs, cost per song, higher than the target again. So we're going to be bringing that into our answer as well. But again, all exactly the same as the pro forma report. So, what I've done here is I've commented on a few costs. Now you can see I've only commented on marketing and other. I haven't gone through them all, and that's for time reasons, because it would be difficult in terms of time to manage to get through every single cost. So we're focused on the costs which have had the biggest increase, the biggest change, and or a reason from the exam paper, and or are the biggest number in total. Like I said with marketing costs, biggest increase and they're the biggest admin expense. So they're the ones that the directors are probably most interested in. A significant change, it's a significant cost. And also the other reason I would prioritize commenting on a particular cost or revenue stream or whatever it is if there's a reason from the exam paper. Now, there wasn't really much in the exam paper on admin costs at all. There was probably more around the cost of sales line expenses. So I've commented on those, and as a percentage of revenue, obviously with other, we could work out the profit on disposal of that catalogue. We could obviously quickly work that out. That would be perhaps more tricky to work out. You didn't have to worry too much about that, but you could briefly just mention that cost had changed. And then again, admin overall in the same way. Headline number, then is it faster or slower than the increase in revenue and the impact that then has on margins, on profit margins. And then we had that KPI, average cost per song. So it's gone up. It's once again above the target. So that's kind of a trend point almost weaved into there. And it should be acknowledged that the impact of new songs and catalogues acquired and sold during the year have not been time apportioned. So that was a point we mentioned with the revenue per song as well, and we talked about that in the AI class. So then EBITDA, in a similar way to gross profit, headline number, what it's increased to, and then focus on the margin, because that's probably more interesting than just the headline number. So a margin decline, so I've added the word concerning, a margin decline, that's quite a significant decline, and we had a benchmark to compare it to, an acceptable minimum. And also, as I explained in the AI class, you could effectively work out what the EBITDA target was, because we've got average revenue per song and average cost per song, which exclude non-cash costs. So therefore, there's like an implicit average profit per song and an implicit average target per song. And what's the reason? So, you focus on this. This is EBITDA has increased, but the margin has gone down. It's below the target. It's also below the competitors. What's the reason for this? Well, average cost per song are increasing faster than revenue. That's what's causing that decline in EBITDA margin. And we talked about this in detail in the AI class. So you can see, when you're analyzing profit, whether it's gross profit, EBITDA, operating profit, focus on the margin and identify the reasons why that's changing, the underlying reasons. Now, that's probably the harder bit than just saying which costs have gone up or down. But we'll do a lot of work on this, on your specific advanced information, to identify things which will cause the margin to go up or down. So then we can see on the marking key that we've got the EBITDA margin that we've mentioned there. We've got the easy marks for bringing in admin overall and the EBITDA overall. Then we've got the margin, it's below the minimum, or you could have compared it to competitors, and I did both and got the marks there. And then also mentioning that acceptable minimum, that specific 25%. Obviously mentioned marketing as well, and then looked at that KPI, calculated the average running costs per song. So you can see how I've quite efficiently worked through revenue, gross profit, and EBITDA, used the numbers in the pre-populated spreadsheet and done some further analysis based on what we knew on the KPIs from the AI, and then also the information that we're given, used the reasons to produce a succinct analysis of revenue, gross profit, and EBITDA. And you can see how this approach enables you to, in a time efficient manner, hit all the points on the marking key. And there's always frustrations, you might get 2 points where it's backslashed, or you might make a good point which isn't on the marking key and therefore you don't get any credit. And that's just the way it goes. So it doesn't always work perfectly like this. You might miss out a few points, but look, most people aren't aiming for 100%, 80% would be nice, I feel, for most people. So you can actually see, getting that type of a mark here isn't, unattainable. You can do that with this approach, and, I've done it and many other students have done it as well. You just need to practice developing an efficient approach to analysing the management accounts, doing further analysis on the numbers, both those that are provided in the spreadsheet and integrating the exam paper information, and then using that as the reasons why things have gone up or down, and then providing that kind of useful insight as I have done there. So in terms of kind of estimating what to write for each section, you'll see that revenue has 2 boxes. It always has had at least 2 boxes, so we continue to assume that. And then gross profit and EBITDA are sharing a box. That's because there's a request for advice, which in almost all cases has always had 2 boxes as well. So because these boxes on the left and the right stay the same, this means that gross profit and EBITDA must be sharing a box. So I'd kind of thought that at the start when I read the requirements, because I thought, well, revenue is these 2, request for advice is these 2. So therefore gross profit and EBITDA must be sharing a box. And therefore that's why I knew that I probably didn't need to comment on every single cost line. And you can see that I prioritized the ones which had significant movements, were the biggest costs, like royalties, marketing, A&R, etc., and the ones which had specific reasons from the exam paper, like A&R, for example, or amortization or purchase and sale costs. So you can see that's how I've decided on which points and which cost lines to focus on there, and have reduced the risk of overrunning to ensure that I have enough time for the request for advice and then also every other part of this exam. So whilst you might be looking at this and thinking, yes, I'm very confident with requirement 1, I've done this before, I could do lots of analysis. Remember, you also need to stick to time so that you do not overrun. And also make sure as well that you copy over your appendix into the word processing area so that you do get any credit for additional numbers that you've calculated. Like we've seen here, analysis of writers, etc. You need to make sure that your answers are included in here in order to get those marks. So there's no negative marking. So the fact that this was provided in the pre-populated spreadsheet is fine, that I've kind of brought that into the appendix. There's no need to do it, or there's no need to copy over the whole financial statements. The reason I've just ended up bringing that in is because that's my mixed figures are derived from these numbers. So that I've started with that, added in these rows, and then I've just kind of brought it all over. You could exclude that if you wanted and just bring over the mixed figures, but it was just a bit quicker and easier for me to do that. And you can just then kind of see what the mixed figures are calculated on. So we have just to make sure that we bring over our appendix, so the examiner can see what we've done. So with the other ACA exams, they currently are, just make sure you bring that into the word processing area. So as you can see, first part of requirement 1, not too difficult, a skill set you're familiar with and is fairly predictable from the advanced information, and it enables you to pick up most of the marks in requirement 1. The key is to make sure that you're very well prepared on it. You've got a good technique to making sure you can do it time efficiently whilst dealing with every section. In most case study exams, there will also be a second part to requirement 1 with a request for advice. So this will typically involve something like a staff bonus or an issue with a staff member, perhaps maybe a bad debt issue with a customer, possibly a problem with a supplier, a product recall. So it varies very much based on the case study business, and it's usually flagged in some way in the AI, we usually get some sort of context on the potential issue. So what we'll usually need to do is perform an additional calculation or piece of analysis, discuss the significance of this, and also possibly identify any ethical issues. Sometimes there are some ethical issues interwoven with the request for advice matter. So as we can see in this requirement one that we've been looking at, you can see in addition to the main part, which is the analysis of the management accounts, we can see that there is also a requirement to respond to the request for advice. And then we can see further down in the exhibit where we were given the information as to why things had gone up or down during the year. We can see that we've got requests for advice and we're told this information here. So it's important to appreciate that this is only 2 boxes on the marking key. So performing really well here isn't essential to pass, but there are some easy marks here. So you definitely do want to, make sure that you attempt it, but just make sure that you don't kind of overrun here or don't focus on it too much, and don't think that, performing well here is kind of essential to scoring well in requirement 1. So we can see here with the request for advice. So we're told about this specific writer, and this was flagged a lot perhaps in the AI because this is one of the writers we were told. There were a couple of writers that we were told a bit more detail on, and this is one of them here. So we're told that the contract is due for renewal shortly, and he has informed us that he's been approached by a competitor. They've offered him an advance and a royalty rate. So we know this is a competitor from the AI. We know that this is a generous advance, and I think this is a more significant advance than the one Jubal had offered him or given him in previous years, and the royalty rate is higher than what Jubal has provided. So we had quite a lot of information actually on this writer from the AI when we were given an example of a writer in that exhibit there. So we can see, what his royalty rates were, what advances were previously. So we've got some context to the issue. And he's implied that unless Jubal matches this offer, then he will sign with the competitor when his contract expires. So he's due to start work on 2 albums for popular country bands shortly. So that sounds as though there will be some future royalties coming in. These expected to be released in October. And we're told as well that he has an outstanding balance from his most recent advance. And we know as well that a writer would need to repay their advance, before they sign with a different publisher. So we're given a bit more direction on the type of points to include here. So please advise us on the factors Jubal should consider when deciding how to deal with this issue and any actions that should be taken. So these are recommendations. So we'd always have some recommendations. Now you can include the recommendations with your other recommendations further down, which we'll come to, or you can have them here. Personally, I have them here under a heading just because I go through the points, and usually I try to think of the recommendations as I go through. So what we're really trying to do here is, calculate any numbers we're required to, have some points about what we know about the party or the issues involved, from the AI, the significance of the issue, the impact on the accounts, the impact on the business, any potential bias, and also, consider any kind of ethics issues as well. And we'll talk about ethics in more detail in requirements 2 and 3, because that's where it typically is examined. So if we think about this issue here, what do we know about the parties involved? Well, we know this writer, and have abbreviated it here, but I'll define it in full the first time it's mentioned in the report, which is the exec summary. So we know he's been a top 10 writer for several years. We know that from the AI. He's been writing since 2015, so he's been with Jubal for a long time. So there should be some goodwill between the writer and Jubal, and that should help negotiations. So when you make a point around, what we know about the party, from the AI or possibly elsewhere in the exam paper, make sure you just kind of develop that and explain, why that's relevant to this specific issue. So yes, what do we know about this writer? Well, he's a top 10 writer. He's been a writer since 2015. So that's kind of what we know about him. So therefore, why is that relevant to this? So there should be some goodwill between them. They've obviously had a long-term relationship, so that should help any potential negotiations. We can also think back to this risk register or strategy that we've discussed before and think about, how does this impact the company's strategic goals or any previously identified risks. And we know that this was an identified risk on the risk register, loss of high profile writers. So we can mention that there. The loss of high profile writers was a previously identified risk. And generous advances were a way to mitigate this risk. So we can see how that there is clearly relevant. And then for any numbers we could work with as well, like I said, we should try to bring those in. And actually, when we looked at the appendix, we saw there with that writer that his revenue had actually declined in the year. So we could bring that point in. So we can see here with our top 10 writer analysis that actually this writer's revenue had declined, and you could comment on, number of songs has only increased by 2, so only released 2 songs. We can see the average revenue per song has obviously declined, and his total share of revenue has declined, so maybe he's becoming a less significant writer, or his performance has been declining. So actually, revenue has declined, he only produced 2 songs. If this decline continues, then royalties will be lower, of course, and the advance may not be repaid. And this could cause impairment of advances to increase. You could mention that point as well, and that's obviously gone up during the year. Obviously, the obvious point that a royalty rate is higher than what he's currently earning that we calculated from the AI and above Jubal's average, which would obviously then have an impact on reducing gross profit and EBITDA, which is already declining. So we can see that's like kind of the impact, the financial impact of this. Mentioned the point as well that we were told as an outstanding advance. We know that would need to be repaid. We were told that in the AI. And then we could think about whether the company has enough cash to make this advance, and actually not currently. If you look on the SFP, if you look on the balance sheet, we can get the cash balance. We can get it, of course, from the bottom of the cash flow statement. So it doesn't have enough now, but that should start to increase as we progress through the new accounting period. So you can see the type of points to make here. In a way, this is similar to kind of almost like a mini requirement 2 or 3 in a way in terms of our exam technique. And we'll talk about that a lot more when we look at requirement 2 or 3, we're being kind of short and concise, making a different point each time, leaving, a line between each to make it nice and easy for the examiner to mark. Whenever we're making a point, we're just relating it specifically to this issue and therefore why this is a relevant consideration and the impact, of course, on the business. So impact on profits, impact on losing writers, impact on the strategy and the risk. Is there enough cash? So then we can go through and have some sensible recommendations. Now, as I said, you might think of these as you go through. So the fact that revenue from Conrad has declined, a recommendation would be identify reasons for that. Maybe it's because he's working on the new albums and therefore hasn't released any other work, or maybe there's a reason why average revenue from the existing songs has gone down. The royalty rate is higher than what's currently paid, so possibly try and negotiate a lower rate. Could verify the offer, maybe just to ensure that it has what's been offered. If his revenue is declining, then maybe link the royalty rate to the revenue. And if this is going to be a possible issue for other writers, then perhaps improve their terms to ensure that this same issue doesn't happen with other successful writers. I'm sure you could think of some other, action points around that as well. And, some of these we'd kind of similar things we thought about previously before the exam, like improving writer contracts. So you can kind of see on the marking key, this is generally kind of the easier box. There might be a context point here, as we've seen here, that I've picked up there. So there were marks in here for identifying that his revenue had gone down, or the average revenue per song had gone down, as we picked up there. And then there's obviously a risk that the advance might not be repaid. And we can see here there was also a mark here for identifying the reason as a recommendation. So this is generally for the more easier points, and then the harder points, the more evaluative points, and the recommendations score marks here. And then a relatively easy point there, picking up that the 50% is higher than the current average, or what he currently earns. So we've got that point there, and then a recommendation, negotiate the rate. This will obviously have an impact on profit margins and EBITDA. The cash balance is insufficient, but you could evaluate that by saying should have more cash in the new year. And then there were some context points, he's been a successful writer, they've had a long relationship, etc. And then there was also, a point about picking up the points about advances and impairments had gone up. And then some other recommendations as well. So you can kind of see there's a few easy points in here, but some of the points are quite difficult. This is generally the harder part of requirement 1. But you should be able to pick up quite a few points in here. But it is, generally speaking, harder than the other areas of requirement 1. So like I said, there's a few easy marks. You should definitely attempt it, but also appreciate that this is probably one of the harder parts of requirement 1. And what you really want to do is a really solid analysis of the management accounts and have a good attempt at this. But what you want to avoid doing is spending too long here, or if there are calculations, spending too long trying to perfect them, because there are easier marks elsewhere. And of course, a mark is worth a mark. So whether you get, this point and get your, half a mark, or whether you kind of get this point and get your half a mark, they're both worth half a mark. So you need to be quite strategic, really, and appreciate there are some parts of the exam which are harder than others, as there are with all the ACA exams. And therefore, you want to make sure that you're getting all the easy bits right first of all, and then you can focus on getting these kind of harder points, rather than the other way around. So have a good attempt at it, as I have done here. Probably say somewhere between kind of 6 and 8 points, and then about 4 recommendations would be a good attempt. And obviously structuring the points as I've mentioned there, I feel like that would be a good attempt on the request for advice. And then that would enable you to move on with sufficient time to make sure you do thorough conclusions and recommendations for the requirement as a whole. Obviously, these recommendations are just specific to this single request for advice matter. So making sure that you get on and do your conclusions and your recommendations as a whole, because these are relatively easy marks. So you don't, want to spend time here trying to get every difficult point here and then not have sufficient time to get the easier marks here. So that's another example of that in terms of being strategic and a bit exam savvy with your exam technique. So then with the conclusions, if we're asked to comment on, revenue, or if we're asked to analyze revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, and EBITDA, and then also the request for advice, then you need some points on all of these in the conclusions. That's what we were asked to do. And it's worth just, thinking back to the requirement at this point and think, okay, what exactly were we asked for? Revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, EBITDA, and the request for advice. And you'll see, these are the headings obviously in the report. I've used that requirement wording to drive my headings. Revenue, I've got my section on revenue, cost of sales and gross profit, EBITDA, and the request for advice. So we've got detailed analysis on each of these. So then we need to conclude on them. Now we've already done the analysis, we've already established what has happened in the year. So we just need a conclusion on each of them. So we're not obviously going to repeat all of our analysis. So we're just going to take the main point for each section. So you can see, I've got a section here on revenue, section here on cost of sales, gross profit, EBITDA, and the point on the request for advice. Now what I've done is I've just taken the main points from each section. So you can see with revenue specifically, we asked for revenue for each source and in total. So in the main body of the report, we've got a paragraph on each. Okay, but we've got a lot of detail there. We've got what it's gone up by, with the reason, further analysis and a context point. We're not going to reproduce all of that in our conclusion because then it's not a conclusion, it's just a complete repetition of the whole analysis. So we just want to take the main point. So we could just take the increase and the reason. And we could do this for each of them. So with performance and then with sync, just the number and the reason. And then with overall, we could just have overall revenue and maybe just the first point, comparing it to the industry growth. So we could just take those points and then we've got a point on each in the conclusion. So you can see digital, I just got the number with the brief reason, performance, number and the point there. Sync, number, and the reason and mechanical. So we're not obviously copying our whole section. We're just taking the main point. So we've got the main concluding point that it's had a good year and it's gone up by this, but we haven't got all the detailed analysis in there. We've saved that for the main body of the report. We may consider bringing some of that back in to the exec summary. And you can see I've done the same thing with, cost of sales. The requirement did ask for cost of sales for each cost category and in total. So therefore, I want to make sure in my conclusions that I've got it in total and by each source because that's what the requirement asks for. Similarly, with cost of sales, I want to have it in total and for each cost category because that's what I was asked to do. So again, I've got it for all of the cost categories, that I commented on in the main body. Yes, I guess, strictly we didn't comment on every single one due to time restraints, but we focused on the main ones, focused on the ones which had the main movements. So once again, you can see with my cost of sales, I obviously had a section for each, royalty, number, reason, further analysis, A&R, number, reason, further analysis. I'm not going to have all of that again in the conclusions. I'm just going to lift the main point, with a brief reason, similarly with, purchase and sale costs. So you can see I've got the main numbers there. That's important. Royalties, with the number and then the small point I had there with royalties. A&R, just with the reason, I haven't got the further analysis points there. And then similarly with purchase costs and amortization. And then with gross profit, and of course, with EBITDA as well. We weren't asked for admin expenses, we were just asked for EBITDA. So for gross profit and EBITDA, we had a lot of detail. We've got the number, the margin, and then the detailed reasons why. EBITDA, the number, the margin, comparing it to the targets, comparing it to competitors, going into the detailed reason, looking at average revenue per song versus average cost per song. But in the conclusion, I've just got the main point. Absolute figure with the margin change and a brief reason. EBITDA said it's gone down, so it's gone up, but concerning margin decline and below the acceptable minimum. So you can see I've just taken the main point, and I'm not repeating everything in the conclusions. We want to keep these kind of nice and short and snappy, but equally they need to have the main points in them. So kind of what is the main point for each section? It's been a good year. These are the changes in the numbers. This is kind of a brief reason why. And then again, for the request for advice, I've taken the main point or two and had that in the conclusions, not repeating everything. And we'll see why it's important to have really kind of short, snappy conclusions when we come on to the exec summary, because this will form the base for the exec summary, because this has got all the main factual information. Revenue has gone up by this, X% to this, and a brief reason why. That is, factual. So that will be the same. Naturally, that will be the same in the conclusions as it is in the main body of the report, because it's just a fact. Even if you rewrote that rather than copying it, it would look the same because it's, factual. There's only so many ways you can rewrite the same point. So then we get to the recommendations, which are just sensible action points based on what has happened in the year. So you need to think, what has happened in the year. So yes, you might go into the exam with all these great action points, but you want to focus on the ones which are most relevant to what has happened, during the year. If we're told about, FX, and it's been really volatile and it's caused a big expense, and yes, hedging FX risk would be a sensible action point. But if there's no mention of that, there's probably ones which are more relevant to make. So, when we think about, what's happened during the year, we know that revenue has grown, particularly digital, because of agreement with a new digital service provider. So, continue to grow digital. We know that's the growing stream, and they've grown it by having a new digital service provider. So continue to grow it via agreements with more digital service providers. You could even equally have said, continue to expand, continue to grow digital and in Asia, because that was like the growth market there perhaps. So we kind of picked that up in our revenue analysis. That was the reason why, and that's obviously improving as well, the effective revenue per stream. So you could have also said, continue to negotiate better deals with DSPs to improve stream rate. We know seeing more placements, but actually lower average revenue per placement. So we could say, pursue higher value sync opportunities. As we said, as I've just mentioned there with the DSPs, negotiate for increased royalty rates. Maybe we've seen royalty rates, the costs, the amount paid to writers increasing, so therefore negotiate lower rates for less successful writers. We've seen some of the targets have been missed, so investigate why. Continue to expand. EBITDA margin has been falling, so maybe link director's bonus to the EBITDA margin, would be a good one there to make sure that this doesn't keep sliding. We've obviously seen that AI has been used. This was mentioned a lot in the advanced information, so we could explore the benefits of using AI as well. So I think requirement one, it probably is a bit easier to kind of predict some recommendations which would be relevant, but it's very important that you focus on the ones which are most relevant and are specific to what has happened during the year, because these are the ones which will end up on the marking key. Focus on Asia because it's grown, continue to grow with more DSP agreements, investigate KPIs which are declining, and you always get a point for your own commercial recommendation as well. So other commercial recommendations. So if you make a sensible recommendation, but it's not on here, then you'll still get that mark. And it is difficult because these points are very specific. You could make lots of good recommendations, but they might just not be on the marking key. And even if you make a sensible recommendation, you won't get a point unless it's on here, other than getting this point. So if you make a recommendation which is a sensible recommendation and it isn't on here, one of these points, and yes, you'll get this, but you only get it once. So, and that's just the nature of case study. If you make a sensible point but it's not on the marking key, then you won't get a point for that. And I know that is different than some other ACA exams, particularly some of the other business-based exams. But that's just, the way it works. And there are a lot of points which are, backslash. There are more points than that. And this marking key, is developed after having reviewed student scripts as well. So there is a good process that is undertaken to ensure that there are lots of sensible points which are included. And if you follow this technique and use the exam paper information and stick to the most kind of obvious points, then you will pick up plenty of marks. But recommendations is kind of a good demonstration there of when you can make a really good sensible point, but it's not on the marking key, and unfortunately you don't get the mark. But that is just the nature of it. But you can kind of see here with this technique, I've managed to pick up all the marks, if not very close to all the marks there. And I don't think there are any points which are incredibly difficult. Sometimes you may have seen in a BPT or a CR exam, you might look at some of the points and just think that is so technically complicated. I don't know, deferred tax on share-based payment, calculating the element that goes to equity, for example, that's incredibly technical. You may look at that and think, I would never be able to get that in the exam. I don't really feel like that's the case with case study. I don't think there's anything on here where you think that's so difficult. I wouldn't be able to get that point. It's so obscure or far-fetched or technically difficult. I don't think that is the case here at all. Like I said, some of the points on a request for advice are a bit tricky, or sometimes you might think, I made some different points and that one, I wouldn't really have thought of that. Okay, fair enough. But the vast majority of the points are obtainable. So as I've already explained, the key is having this really robust exam technique, which will help you ensure that you attempt every section and that you're likely to get the points which are on the marking key. And that really kind of stems from using the information that the examiners have given us as much as possible, the reasons why things have gone up or down, and using the numbers that they've given us as much as possible, doing further analysis on these numbers and bringing the relevant AI points in where they are specifically relevant. So you can see that's how we would have dealt with requirement 1 to have come up with a nice, complete requirement 1. So then coming on to the exec summary, what we should do is do each section, as we go through. So we'll do the requirement 1 section of the exec summary. So exec summary, as I'm sure you are aware, summary of the key points of the report. There should be nothing new in the exec summary. So we don't add completely new points which aren't in the main body of the report. So if we are preparing a summary of requirement 1, then inherently this will be very similar to the conclusions. Because what have we had to do for requirement 1? Well, we've had to analyze the performance for the year and explain the performance for the year. We focus on revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, EBITDA, and the request for advice. And we've established what's happened here. We've undertaken the analysis, we've given the explanation as to why each item has gone up or down, the reasons why, and we've undertaken some further analysis of those numbers. So we've already done all of the work. So like I said, when we're concluding on it, there's nothing new in the conclusions either. We're just kind of concluding on what we have done here. So as I said, what's happened, the performance and the reasons for that performance, are factual. Okay, there might be a bit of our opinion in there, but most of that is factual. So that doesn't change in the conclusions because it's factual. We're just taking the main points from the main body and putting that in the conclusions. So when we're concluding on this subject matter, there's nothing new. We're just bringing in the main points. And if we summarize that subject matter, then we'll be doing the same thing. So there's an inherent similarity between conclusions and exec summary. If you're concluding on a subject matter, or if you're summarizing a subject matter, then yes, they're going to look broadly similar. But there are some key differences and some additional things we need to do for the exec summary. But actually, if we're summarizing the performance for the year, that's going to be very similar to when we've concluded on the performance for the year. So the fact our conclusions includes kind of all of the basic numbers. So, revenue's gone up, cost of sales has gone up, because of this. EBITDA margin has gone down from this to this. They're just facts. So they're going to be the same in the conclusions and in the exec summary. So what you could do as a starting point is you could copy your conclusions into your exec summary to give you the basis of your exec summary. But remember, the conclusions didn't include much value add analysis. They just include the basic facts. Revenue's gone up, it's above the industry growth. Digital's gone up by, this to this, because of the new agreement with the DSP in Asia. Performance revenue has gone up slightly by this. So there isn't, if you think back, we just took kind of the number and the brief reason. There isn't any of that kind of insightful further analysis in the conclusions. So the conclusions have just kind of got the number and the reason. So if we copy the conclusions to the exec summary as a starting point, it's just kind of got like the raw facts, the raw basic points for everything we've been asked to analyze and therefore conclude on and summarize on. So it's kind of got the main numbers. So this is the unhighlighted text here. Overall revenue has gone up by this to this. Digital revenue has gone up from this to this. So there isn't really kind of any insightful analysis here. It's just the basic numbers. But it's comprehensive because we've covered everything that we have been asked to do. So it gives you kind of a good base of the numbers. And even if you rewrote them from scratch from the exec summary, that would broadly look the same because the facts are the facts. Like I said, there's only so many ways you could rewrite the fact that overall revenue has gone up by 24.6% to 68.329 million. How else can you rewrite that? It's impressive. You could possibly change that adjective. It's above the industry growth of 3%. You can't really rewrite that in any way. So even if you did rewrite this point, it definitely needs to be in there. You need to have a point on overall revenue in the conclusions and in the exec summary. And even if you did rewrite it from scratch for each, it would look exactly the same anyway. So you can save yourself some time by having some really concise conclusions and then copying them over to the exec summary as a starting point. But this is where the skill comes in. What you then need to do is to think about which additional further analysis points you might want to bring in, because remember, the conclusions were quite bare. They've just kind of got the main points in them. So we've kind of got that unhighlighted text, just those raw basic points, but then we can add in some further analysis points because we did undertake a lot of useful analysis that the directors would be interested in. Think about who's reading the executive summary. It's going to be like the busy executives, the directors. Yes, they want the main points about the performance, but they also want to kind of have perhaps some more detailed analysis on the key areas. So you need to show some judgment, I think, which, areas are the key areas for the directors, to consider. What would they be interested in? A director, they'll be thinking about things like, has there been a significant change in profit margins? Have we got a particular, source or territory which is growing, or declining? They're probably not concerned about a 1% increase in personnel costs. If that's kind of in line with inflation, for example, it's, that's not what they're concerned about, or a 2% decline in other. They're concerned about the big drivers of the business performance, key revenue streams, key changes in those revenue streams, changes in profit margins, KPI targets which have or haven't been met or significant changes in them, cash, and then also the request for advice that we may have been asked for. So therefore you can see how I've added some more detail on what I felt were the key areas. So you can see here, like the KPIs, we didn't have these in the conclusion. So I've added some more on the KPIs. We only had a couple of KPI points in the conclusions, like EBITDA target, things like that. So I've added more detail on the KPIs, particularly ones which have are now kind of had a significant change, or you can see with the top 10 writers, that's exceeded the limit. So you can see that there, or more positively, portfolio growth is now above the target. The number of streams, and where I've done an additional analysis calculating the effective revenue per stream as well, which was quite interesting. I've added that. Digital is the fastest growing stream. So therefore I've added some more detail there. And then I've added some points in here by region as well, particularly because that ASA growth was so significant. So I've added that there. I haven't added more detail on, a small kind of like amortization point or something like that, or a small point on personnel costs. I focus on adding more value add analysis to those areas. Again, added a bit more on the KPI there. And then with the EBITDA margin, for example, is below the target, but then I've added in some more detail saying it's now lower than competitors, given some more explanation of the underlying reason why it's going down. And that's obviously looking at the interaction of those KPIs, average cost per song and average revenue per song as well. So you can see what I've done there. So you start with your conclusions, but that's where this real skill comes in with the exec summary. And then with the recommendations, it's very important that you focus on the ones which you feel are the most important action points that a company should undertake, and the ones which affect the most significant areas, as we've just said, key revenue streams, profit margins, KPIs, etc. So, continue to grow revenue, investigate why royalties are declining as a percentage of revenue, and then a couple around the request for advice. So when we look at the marking key for the exec summary, you can see, these were the conclusions. So obviously these points need to be in the conclusions. Obviously, if you're concluding on a report on performance of revenue, gross profit, EBITDA, and a request for advice, obviously you'd have a point on each of those in the conclusions. But as I explained, if you're summarizing that as well, you're also going to have a point on that in the exec summary. So yes, a few of the points in the exec summary are relatively easy to get. But then we can add in those additional points to try to get these points, which is a difficult skill to do. So, more points on the margin. So I mentioned some points there. This is obviously a recommendation as well, investigating a cost increase, which is obviously related to that, continuing to grow. So, a lot of the additional points are recommendations, rather than necessarily further analysis, but sometimes they are some kind of like further analysis points as well. Now, you might think, well, why don't I just add in lots more points to the exec summary and I'm more likely to get the points? Well, does this mark here appropriate summary of report section? And actually that's a very easy point to get. And you can obviously see here that there aren't that many marks in the exec summary. So obviously we want to get this point, and you want to keep your exec summary at an appropriate length. So if you keep your conclusions, nice and concise, and you're showing to the examiner that you're demonstrating the skill of then selectively bringing in some additional points. So you've selectively thought about which points belong in the exec summary. The key headline numbers and the insightful pieces of analysis around the main numbers, and then some specific recommendations on the main issues, then you'll get that mark. So what you want to avoid is obviously just kind of copying, the vast majority of your requirement one, hoping that you would hit, all of these points. Copying over like excessive amounts without showing any skill or consideration as to what should be included in the exec summary. So you can see with this approach, it is exam efficient, it is time efficient in that, concise conclusions mean that you've got the raw numbers in there. It's making sure that you are addressing the key factual points for everything that we've been asked to. So that will save you time bringing that in, and that frees up some time for you to add in a bit of value add analysis in terms of, those additional points, additional pieces of work we did, in the main body of the report, which weren't in the conclusions, like those further insight points, here and here. You can bring in a few of those, and then you can selectively think about which recommendations are the most relevant, and then bring in a few of those. If we've got 8 recommendations in the main body, then you're only bringing kind of like 4 or 5 into the executive summary. So obviously, don't reproduce all of them, because then the exec summary isn't a summary. So therefore, again, you need to carefully think about which ones to include. But it is difficult. I feel like the exec summary boxes, it's almost a little bit like one extreme to the other, because obviously these are easy if you've got good conclusions and you bring them in and you've kept them nice and concise. But actually getting the very specific recommendations or the very specific further, analysis points that they were looking for is difficult. Probably, along with the request for advice, in my opinion, I would say that these points are the hardest bits of requirement 1. So the hardest bits are getting the specific points in the exec summary that they were looking for, and the request for advice, and possibly a few recommendations. But actually the vast majority of it, and some of the evaluation points sometimes can be a bit tricky, but the vast majority of it isn't too bad at all. And once you've practiced them, with the mock exams, you'll start to really develop an efficient exam technique for this requirement 1. And as I said, it probably is the most predictable of the requirements. You've practiced this skill and this exam technique before with these types of questions in earlier exams, as I've explained. So you really need to just practice and build up this technique. This technique to me is second nature. I can do any of these performance analysis questions on not just case study or any of the case study exams that have come up, any requirement 1, but also the BST, CI, SPM, analysing like this is just second nature to me now, and that's just come from practice. So, I'd highly advise you to practice as many case studies as you can. If you do a case study exam, then you can practice, several mock exams on it, just to get used to analysing like this, preparing the appendix, looking for the reasons why it's changed, bringing that all together with some further analysis, and just getting used to going through different streams one after the other. You really start to build up speed, which is obviously crucial in the exam, because if you can make your points more efficiently, then you'll obviously score more marks because you've got more time. Going through all the costs, calculating the margins, developing a good understanding of what causes changes in margins. Practice as many as you can would be my advice, because like I said, all of this is second nature. I don't even need to plan. I know exactly what I'm doing for every requirement like this. I know exactly what needs to go into the conclusions. I know exactly what I'm doing for my exec summary, and I know what the marking key looks like as well. And as I've said, it all just comes from practice. So if you can kind of build yourself up to that level, which you certainly can do, because it just requires effort and practice, then you'll be able to get through this quickly, and you'll be able to get through all of the marks, and you'll be able to produce something like my model answer. It really isn't rocket science. It really has just come from practice over time. So just to give you a few kind of tips on requirement 1. So as I've said, read the requirement very carefully and use it for your report headings. I can't emphasize this enough. It's surprising how many students at kind of possibly the final exam they'll ever do in their life, after perhaps decades of doing exams, often don't read a question properly, or try to answer a question they hope had come up. So for example, if it didn't ask at EBITDA and asked you to stop at gross profit, don't include EBITDA. So just make sure you read it carefully and think what you need to include in that. If it asks you for gross profit, obviously you need to analyse cost of sales anyway, because that forms part of gross profit. So just think about that carefully and use that for your requirement headings, because that will ensure you answer everything, but then that will follow through, and that will ensure you've got a conclusion on everything, which will then follow through and ensure that you've got a point in the exec summary for everything. So misreading the requirement or trying to answer a question you hoped would come up really can be detrimental. So I said practice Appendix 1 to improve speed, calculating the numbers, etc. So you can obviously do that with the mock exams for your business. And to be honest with you, that applies to the whole requirement really. As I've just said, just practice it. That will improve your speed. You get quicker. You've got time to make more points. You make more points. You're more likely to score more marks. So in terms of planning, students often ask quite a lot about, how much should I plan? Well, I think you'll go into the exam with a kind of a broad plan in terms of the different sections. You can see here, this is what I produced before the exam, thinking about what's likely to come up and the types of points I might make and the areas I may look at. So you've really got a plan here. So as I said, as I was reading through this information, I said, oh, well, this is going to be my reason why, digital's gone up. So you might scribble a point on here about your number of streams or something like that. So, and obviously had to give some consideration about how much to write for each section as well. So I thought I'll do revenue. I'll have my, 5 points here and it will be on the streams, and I'll have a point on mix. So, I'd probably kind of plan vaguely, just have kind of an idea of where I'm going to focus on. Obviously, when we looked through costs, we saw these had some information from the exam paper, so you might want to kind of highlight those and scribble on the reasons. So you might decide to plan those a bit, but you don't need to kind of over plan. You don't then need to plan your conclusions. You saw how I did those. I just looked back at the requirement wording, thought, right, what do I need to conclude on? So I did all of that kind of almost kind of mentally, and then I thought, okay, I'll bring a point from here into here. So don't spend too long having a kind of separate planning exercise. If you're well drilled in a requirement, you should know exactly what you need to do. As I said, use exam paper information as much as possible. So just really not just the narrative information, as I did. The examiner also gave us all of this information at the top 10 writers. So, I've used that, I've weaved that into my analysis. We were given these KPI targets. I calculated the KPIs myself. So make sure, in addition to using these reasons as much as possible, basically effectively used every point that the examiner's given me here to generate points for my answer. And if you look on the marking keys, it's generally points from the exam paper information, which scores a lot of marks. I think I emphasize this a lot of the time about the request for advice. It's a potential time trap. It's not essential amount of marks for the exam. You can still do very well without performing particularly well here. Definitely attempt it, definitely get the easy points, but don't get too bogged down in it. With the conclusions in the exec summary, make sure you're thorough with the numbers. But that should follow through. If you've done that in the main body of the report, which you will have done if you're using this technique, we've always got the numbers there, that should feed through into your conclusions and exec summary. And you've probably noticed from my writing style, I'm very kind of short and concise. And that's just an effective exam technique. Why turn this into a big woolly paragraph when if you look up, what you need, you just need to kind of the number and the reason. So you want to get used to writing concisely. And some of that comes from practice. And some of it kind of depends on, what you're used to. If this isn't a beautifully written piece of work. If I was writing a kind of essay for university or, something for a book that's, engaging or anything like that, it's, this absolutely isn't what I would do. This is kind of straight to the point, boring language, getting the point across in as little words as possible. There's no flowery language here. This isn't a well-written piece of work. In fact, it's almost quite badly written in a lot of places, but it's just short, concise and straight to the point, because I can do that in less time, and therefore I can make more points, and therefore I can get more marks. So keep it short, keep it concise. I haven't got lots of nicely written paragraphs in here. I'm not saying, following on from the above discussion, we will now turn to marketing and promotion costs, and then go on. These have increased by, that first sentence is just a complete waste. There is no mark for that. There is no mark for, does it read really well? Does it flow really well? There's a sensible logic. I've put things under sensible headings. It flows through almost like from an accountant's point of view, in that I've done, cost of sales, then gross profit, then admin. It's very nicely structured in terms of like the examiner being able to mark it. But it isn't, in terms of like a well-written piece of work, because it doesn't need to be. There's no mark for that. I want to be short. I want to be concise. So just really look in detail how I've structured my points, and try to develop this short and concise writing style yourself. So in terms of time, each requirement is worth the same amount of marks. So spend the same amount of time on each requirement. So it does vary. This varies by person. It might take you a bit longer with the appendix, but then you can type it up quicker, or, kind of vice versa. So some of this comes from experimentation. This is where I personally start as kind of a default, but as you practice more mock exams, you might tweak it for yourself. This is kind of optional. Some people, when you get to the exam, they just want to read all the requirements to make sure, there aren't any real nasty surprises. I can't think of any case study exams where there have been any nasty surprises, but I think people always naturally worry, what happens if they do something completely different from my exam? It's incredibly unlikely, but some people like to just read the requirements for reassurance. And to be honest, I think I even did that on my exam just to see what was ahead of me. Leave 5 minutes for the cover page and the disclaimer, and you might just want to leave a few minutes just for any possible overruns. But tweak it as you see fit. 5 minutes of that's probably a bit long, so you can tweak it as you see fit. But what I want to emphasize here is I would keep the same amount of time for each requirement, because they are worth the same amount of marks. But you may decide as you practice that you want to tweak that yourself, as you go through. That's kind of personally what I did. So I've now demonstrated the exam technique for you to use. So I think after this class, just go away and practice a few requirement ones. Been through the technique from that. It's quite fresh. So if you haven't already, just familiarize yourself with the AI for this case study. So there's the AI analysis video where I go through exhibit by exhibit, kind of explaining it. As part of the course, you've got access to that. As part of the course, you've got access to this document as well. So yes, I know, going through a past AI really seems like, like a lot of work, or it's not relevant to your actual exam. But this will really, really help you. Practicing your exam technique now will really, really help you. And as I've said, the reason I've got so good at all of these requirements is just from practice. And I practice lots of past case study exams. I practiced every past case study exam that was available to me. Now, there weren't as many back then, because the exam was still relatively new. So I wouldn't suggest that you go and do every single one. But if you could do, maybe between 2 and 6 from the most recent years, that would be good to do. But certainly do at least kind of this one as a very minimum. So yes, there's a bit of time investing in the AI. But to be honest, when you're doing like SBM exams, the information in there is kind of quite long. You have to read through quite a bit of information to practice an exam question. It's just a bit of a longer scenario here, but you've got all this to help you. You've got the AI analysis document, you've got the AI analysis video where I go through it exhibit by exhibit. So just that will give you enough background on the AI. And then that obviously opens you up to be able to practice, mock exams on it. So with this one, you've got this requirement. So I'd start with this first of all and just practice, what I've did, structuring it, analysing the numbers, doing the appendix. So you can practice our mock exams for past case studies as I've just demonstrated there. And then there's obviously the ICAEW actual exam. And then for exams in 2024, so for the July 24, so this one, Jubal, and then for November 24 as well, WMP, ICAEW are going to be amending their actual exams to then include some pre-populated spreadsheets in them as well. So they're really good to practice as well. So you can kind of see by familiarizing yourself with the 2024 AIs, you can then go and practice some amended ICAEW exams, and you can also practice our mock exams, which, as you've seen with this one, we've amended to include pre-populated spreadsheet information. So you've kind of got that available to you as well. So we'll be doing 2 of those. So there'll be 2 ACA Masters July 24 mocks, which will have pre-populated spreadsheets in, and 2 ICAEW ones. So familiarize yourself with this AI, and then you've got 4 mock exams you can practice. So 4 requirement 1s, 4 requirement 2s, 4 requirement 3s. So you can really develop your exam technique, your understanding of the marking key, what you need to do for each section, really practicing that exam technique. So yes, there's an investment in the advanced information, but with our course materials available to you, the pro forma document and the AI analysis, it isn't that difficult. And then you've got access, you can in practice 4 case study exams. So, go away, attempt, this one, first of all, perhaps, and then also mark your answer to see which points you got and which points you didn't got. And that's a really important part of the process, because that helps you develop your understanding of the marking key. Which points are in each requirement, which points are in each box, type of points are available, and then you can assess your performance and see which points you're getting, which points you're missing, and therefore, kind of go back to the class and understand how you get those points. And then also you can compare your answer to my model answer, and then you can see which points you did well, but also how you should have structured some of your other points. How, if you struggled with time, how you could have made these points more concise. How you should have laid out your appendix, etc. So, with all of these resources available to you, you really can master your case study exam technique in advance of your live AI coming out. And believe me, if you've done this and you're before your live AI comes out, you know exactly what each requirement involves, exactly what the marking key looks like in the boxes, and you know what you need to do for each requirement, then it's going to make it much easier when it comes to your case study business, because you'll be able to analyze that AI in a more active way. You'll be going through your AI and you'll read this and think, well, that's a context point for requirement 1, industry growth. This is causing a change in the margin. I'll be using that in, my requirement 1, or the company's got some cash issues. That'll be a context point in requirement 2 or 3. This is obviously the requirement 2 calculation. It will be so much easier. You'll be able to do it so much more actively. It'll be a much less stressful process when you get to that. And then when you're practicing the mock exams for your case study, you'll just be practicing applying it to your specific case study business, rather than having to deal with basic issues like, what do I include in an ethics section, or what do I need to do for the conclusions and the exec summary, or how long should a recommendation be? Things like that. You can iron all of that out in advance. So, I highly advise you to do that if possible. If you don't start this until after the AI has been released, you can still do it. It's not too difficult, but obviously you can give yourself a great head start, and that's what I'd always encourage people to do. Give yourself head start, give yourself as much time as possible, and there's so much work you can do with case study prior to your AI coming out, which is contrary to popular belief. Really, everybody thinks it's all about your live AI, but actually the exam technique can be developed in advance. And yes, familiarize yourself with an AI, and then you can practice several exams on it to develop your exam technique, just as you have done with the previous exams. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I look forward to helping you in the other case study videos.